When buying this 4GB AMD Radeon R9 380, I expected it to perform somewhat similar or maybe even a bit worse than the older R9 280. You see, the 300 series was peak Rebrandeon era. And if you think that's an exaggeration, I'll have you know that the variant of the R9 370 that we reviewed earlier on the channel was basically a rebrand of the R7 265, itself a rebrand of the HD 7850. So I was expecting that the Antigua GPU used by the R9 380 was nothing more than a slight update on the Tahiti GPU used by the R9 280, itself a rebrand of the HD 7950. But there was something more to the Antigua than the 12.0 DirectX feature level support. We can ignore the frequency differences since they are small. However, the 4GB of VRAM stand out compared to the 3 that the R9 280 has. However, the R9 280 enjoys a memory bus that is 50% wider than the 256-bit bus used by the R9 380. And we'll see if this trade-off was worth it later in the video. But for now, we'll have a look at the thermal solution that was selected to cool off the 190 watts TDP chip. We're talking about a decent fin stack coupled to 3 heat pipes. The orientation of the fins allows the air to escape through the I/O plate and the back of the card, instead of building up close to the PCIe slot. Two 95mm DC controlled fans complete the setup for a total weight of 690 grams, keeping the card from exceeding 74 degrees in load for a delta over ambient of 51 degrees. As for the test system used, it's a custom PC using the Ryzen 5 5600, 32GB of DDR4 running at 3600 MHz in dual channel on a B350 Tomahawk board. Marvel Rivals and Robocop Rogue City outright refused to launch, complaining about the hardware not having support for DirectX 12. This happened also with another 12.0 feature level GPU, indicating that these games need a little bit more than that. Cyberpunk 2077 behaved a bit odd, with the R9 380 providing somewhat playable results at 1080 resolution and the low settings profile, 41 FPS on average and 29 FPS for the 1% lows. Dropping the resolution to 1600 by 900 but then going for medium settings provides similar results and helps us get a feel of what the card can do. The R9 280 behaves a bit worse at stock 1080 low settings by 10 FPS for both average and 1% lows. When using low settings, Arc Raiders remains playable at all 3 tested resolutions. At 1080 resolution, the R9 380 averaged 53 FPS and got 47 for the 1% lows. These numbers increase as the resolution drops, reaching as high as 73 FPS for the average and 58 for the 1% lows at 720 resolution. As for the R9 280, you've seen it running in a previous video, where it averaged 43 FPS at 1080 resolution and got 34 FPS for the 1% lows. Still playable, but noticeably worse than the 380. Fortnite turned out to be an odd one. The R9 380 struggled big time at 1080 resolution. The average FPS of 74 is fine, but the 1% lows were atrocious. Dropping the resolution ever so slightly then got much better numbers, with the train maintaining also for 720 resolution. But still, the performance difference between 1600 by 900 and 720 resolution is quite small, with close values for the averages and 1% lows. The R9 280 however averaged 134 FPS and got the 1% lows at 83. I redid the test for 1080 resolution just to make sure I didn't screw up anything, but I'm going to scratch this one to legacy drivers. Control runs pretty much the same on both cards, but before we compare them, let's have a look at how the R9 380 performs. 1080 resolution and the low settings profile, which in turn has quite a few options that are not at their lowest, so 1080 low settings has the card averaging 54 FPS with 1% lows at 36. This is pretty much the same way as what the R9 280 gets, with the two cards performing a couple of FPS one from another. Doom Eternal and GCN1 cards usually mean rendering artifacts, but the R9 380 is GCN3 and it showed no issue. At 1080 resolution and high settings, the card averaged 65 FPS and managed 51 FPS for the 1% lows. I can definitely play the game like this, and I'm happy knowing that I can always knock down the quality settings a bit if I need more FPS. Apex Legends did not want to run on the R9 280, which is quite unfortunate considering that the game is still quite popular. The R9 380 however didn't have any issues running the game at low settings, and managed averages between 95 and 135 FPS depending on the resolution. The 1% lows are also playable between 72 and 94 FPS. Far Cry 6 manages playable 1% lows even at 1080 resolution and ultra settings on the R9 380. The average lands at 34 FPS while the 1% lows manage 30. Reducing the settings to high allows the GPU to reach 42 FPS on average and 37 FPS for the 1% lows. The comparison with the R9 280 was done at these last high settings. The GCN1 card averaged 29 FPS, 13 fewer than the 380, and got 25 FPS for the 1% lows, for basically the same difference against the 380. The R9 380 managed 44 FPS on average in Resident Evil 4. The test was performed at 1080 resolution and prioritized performance preset, but disabled FSR. The 1% lows managed 30 FPS, so the game is playable. The R9 280, however, averaged 13 FPS less and didn't manage to break 20 FPS for the 1% lows. The game experience is significantly worse on the GCN1 card. The R9 380 might end up being CPU bottlenecked in Counter-Strike 2 at low settings, so I decided to test the card at 1080 resolution, medium settings and no FSR. I then got 130 FPS for the average and 98 for the 1% lows. The GCN1 card, however, averaged 30 FPS less at just above 100. The 1% lows is also reduced to 77 FPS. Both cards can play the game, but the 380 we're reviewing today performs better. Borderlands 3 is quite playable at 1080 resolution and medium settings. I targeted 30 FPS for the 1% lows and, during the CAN benchmark, the R9 380 delivered 34 with the average FPS planted in the mid-40s. The R9 280 is also able to provide playable frame rates with 39 FPS for the average and 32 FPS for the 1% lows. DOTA 2 will stay CPU bound with both GPUs at 1080 resolution, low settings and full render scaling. The average FPS recorded for the R9 380 was close to 160, while the 1% lows stayed at 67 FPS. For the finals, the aim is to get at least 60 FPS for the 1% lows at low settings. The R9 380 can do it, but only at 720 resolution. The average FPS range between 55 and 81 FPS between 1080 and 720 resolutions, and the 1% lows go between 32 and 60 for the same pixel counts. At the same 720 resolution, however, the R9 280 performs quite a bit worse, at 55 FPS for the average and 39 for the 1% lows. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another single-player title, so the R9 380 only needs to cross 30 FPS for the 1% lows. And the card manages to do just that at 1080 resolution and higher settings. The average FPS was 39, which is just fine for this game. But under the same conditions, the R9 280 fares a bit worse, with 28 FPS for the average and 19 for the 1% lows. To get somewhat the same performance as with the 380, you'd need to drop to medium settings with the GCN1 card. R9 380 users can play Terminator Resistance at 1080 resolution and epic settings. The average FPS lands in the low 50s and the 1% lows gets close to 40 FPS. Perfectly fine for a stealth single-player title. I for one expected that the bandwidth advantage of the R9 280 to prevail. I figured that using low settings and somewhat modest resolutions would negate the extra 1GB VRAM advantage that the R9 380 has. But in most cases, the R9 380 provided better performance, and in the case of Apex Legends, it was also the only card to run the game. To me, it seems that the R9 380 is the better card, because of this somewhat better compatibility with some of the more recent titles. My main issue with the R9 380, and with all cards in the 300 series, is that they could only compete in terms of value. For pure performance, you'd have to get one of those 900 series cards from Nvidia. But how does that value proposition look now, more than 10 years after it was released? The cheapest R9 380 I could find was priced at about 45 USD. While not breaking the bank, it is uncomfortably close to the more powerful RX 570 or even the 4GB variants of the RX 580, with the Polaris cards being occasionally cheaper. But anyway, in the next GPU video we'll take a look at the competition that the 300 series Radeons had to face. As for this one, we're done. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked this review, and I'll see you for the next one.